Clinton and Trump pull no punches.
From the Battelle studio at WOSU at COSI, this is Columbus on the Record. Joining Mike Thompson this week, Joe Ingles, State House reporter for Ohio Public Radio, Mark Niket, reporter for Bloomberg News, Sam Gresham of Common Cause Ohio, and Gene Krebs, former state legislator.
The old cliche says Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have taken the gloves off. Of course, that assumes the gloves were on at one point. The candidates pointed harsh criticism at each other this week. First, Hillary Clinton, here in Columbus, blasted Trump's business record.
He's written a lot of books about business. They all seem to end at chapter 11. You might think that because he has spent his life as a businessman, he'd be better prepared to handle the economy. Well, it turns out he's dangerous there too. Just like he shouldn't have his finger on the button, he shouldn't have his hands on our economy.
Then the next day in New York, Donald Trump went hard after Clinton's character.
Hillary Clinton may be the most corrupt person ever to seek the presidency of the United States. As you know, most people know, she's a world-class liar.
Hyperbole, Mark. I guess you could say that the general election campaign is on in full force. There's no doubt now.
Right, and we're at that stage now where it seems to be a game of trying to make two very unpopular candidates even more unpopular by, in the case of Hillary Clinton, trying to disparage everything that people might like about Donald Trump in terms of his standing as a businessman, his experience as a businessman, and Donald Trump going exactly where Hillary's vulnerable. Hillary Clinton, sort of voters' sense of whether you can trust her or not, or whether she's, up to the job. And it's surprising to me that we're only in June, and this is the tenor of the campaign, and I'm wondering how far we can go from here.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing is the campaigns that their primary opponents should have run against them. That's listening to that clip, I'm going, well, these are all the things that Bernie Sanders should have said about Hillary, and these are all the things that the other 16 should have said about the Donald. So I think that's why we're still seeing the primary play out.
I think we have somebody's going to have to ask him a question. If she's a crook, give me evidence of it. And nobody's asked him that question.
It's only a half-hour show, Sam. And I wish we had can we do a 3-hour documentary? And can we also include Vern Reif, too? That's another story.
But Joe, when I listened to both speeches, some of the stuff, none of it was really new.
No.
But we've heard the things about Hillary many times before by Republicans. We haven't heard the attacks on Donald Trump, at least all in one speech, before. So which do you think had more of an impact on independent voters who are moderate, undecided, if there are any?
That's difficult to say. But what I'm noticing with this speech and what's been happening the last couple of weeks with Democrats especially is they are posturing. They're taking positions that they know pull popular with the electorate. For example, we saw the gun sit-in this week in Congress. Well, the Democrats were trying to say 90% of people want more gun control, so we're with you. They kept, with different things. We've got the Supreme Court nomination that they've been sitting on. That's another thing. And in her speech earlier this week, she kept saying, all of these popular positions and staking her claim there. And then the follow-up to that is he's dangerous. Look at him. He's dangerous.
Mark, it goes to Donald Trump's business record, which isn't as well known perhaps by most people as Hillary Clinton's record as First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State.
Right, and I think that's calculated. I think one of the ideas is that part of Donald Trump's support comes from people who like the idea that he's not a politician, he's a businessman, he can bring sort of corporate, effectiveness to running a government. And another thing that Hillary Clinton's trying to do, I think, is point out that the whole Donald Trump America First, Make America Great thing. Look at his record. She had this long litany of ties, suits, other materials that are products that he has that are made overseas.
That's hard to explain away. One thing Donald Trump has not shown to be is a good political fundraiser. The fundraising totals came out this week, and if you take a look at those numbers, Hillary Clinton has raised, according to the latest Federal Elections Commission report, $42 million. Donald Trump just over $1 million, $1.3 million. Gene Krebs, that's what a congressional candidate would run. There's no way you can run a presidential campaign on that little money.
Actually, we will spend probably on the Republican side $2 million on one state Senate seat here in Ohio.
More than that, Jim.
How much does that worry you?
One state Senate seat. Well, I got to tell you, all this stuff worries all the Republicans who would like to see a viable conservative message put forward, which is why all of a sudden the dump Trump movement is not as dead as it was a month ago, and there is a incredibly mischievous move to require, in a rule change, require all candidates, before their names are placed in the nomination on the floor of the Republican National Convention, to have issued their last 7 years of IRS tax forms.
Ooh, going after him, huh?
And if you can't do that, you can't get your name placed in nomination.
You know, the sad part about that is Trump is a synthesis of everything that the Republican Party has represented itself to be for the last 10 years.
Well, actually, here's the problem, though. I put Donald Trump as a cad and Bill Clinton as a cad. And the reason that many of us have great antipathy towards the Clintons is because of everything that Bill Clinton represents. What's so bizarre is that many Republicans have chosen somebody who is a cad, just like Bill Clinton's a cad. And you can't deny Bill Clinton is a cad.
But, Joe Ingles, voters are angry. And you saw in Britain what angry voters can do.
Yes.
I mean, they made the choice to leave the European Union, even though everyone said it's a bad deal. But they're fed up, and you can see the same thing here.
You can, and that's the problem here. Voters are angry. That you can feel it. It's palpable, and you really don't know where voters are going to go with this. I mean, in traditional elections, you could have a strategy that works, but everything here is new. It's different, and what has worked before isn't necessarily working now.
I think the most interesting thing about this upcoming election is who turns out. And if you get young people to turn out, if you get people of color and women to turn out, you get one result. But if those groups don't show up, then we'll get an entirely different result.
What keeps those folks away?
The ability, sometimes local governments creates obstacles for them to go to vote. People don't get messages that are necessary to get them out.
How about enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton?
It's not a question of that anymore. You go because you hate somebody or you for somebody. And in this case, we may not be for Hillary, but we hate Donald Trump. So we're gonna go to vote.
All right. Rob Portman has a lot more money than Ted Strickland and Donald Trump for that matter, and it looks like he's going to have to spend a lot of it to boost his name recognition. The latest Quinnipiac poll shows the two candidates are still tied, and it has been that way for months. But despite Portman's ad blitz, he still lacks name recognition. More than a third of Ohio voters don't know enough about him to make a decision, while 1 in 5 don't know much about Ted Strickland. Joe Ingles, we've seen these ads, pro and con on Rob Portman, positive and negative against him, but why is he still at 35%? We don't know enough about you.
I don't know that people are really paying attention right now. I mean, they're hearing the really outrageous things that are happening, but as far as ads, really are people paying attention to ads in June? I don't know. We see a lot of these outside groups, not Portman's own money, but the PACs that support him are out there with their ads.
And opposing him. There's been a lot of negative ads, too.
Right,
Yeah.
Exactly. And we're seeing that right now, which gives some name recognition, but I don't know that people are paying attention in June.
But what Portman's doing is the same playbook that Kasich used against Strickland in 10, which was he's going out early with money and defining who Ted is, especially in the Appalachian community. And one of the things you've heard me say before, that is a swing group in Ohio. In 06, it voted strongly for Ted. This time it voted for Trump. Okay? And so what I think you may see this time is trying to pull that away. Now, once again, this leads to a whole lot of churn and froth out there. And I agree with Sam. It's going to be extraordinarily hard to predict.
Mark, but he's been senator for 6 years. He was member of the Bush administration, congressman. Granted, it's only one part of Ohio where he represented. Shouldn't he be above or below 35% unknown at this point?
Yeah, that's what's surprising given his political history. And I think the Democrats do see it as an opportunity to do what Gene's talking about, and that is to define him as well at a point where voters don't have a high name ID for him. And I think you're seeing that particularly on the issue of guns recently with the shootings in Orlando. You saw Ted Strickland come out really hard against Portman, not supporting the effort to ban folks from on the no-fly list from getting guns, and Portman really kind of struggling how to play that issue in Congress, knowing that he's in the Senate, knowing that he's vulnerable on that issue, and how do you play that so that you don't sort of anger the folks on the NRA side who really support gun rights and the folks on the other side who really want to see something done.
Ted's in an interesting position. Ted can cut into Portman's strength, which is the South, Southern Ohio. And if Ted can get Cuyahoga County this time, last time when he was running for governor, the only reason he wasn't re-elected governor is because he couldn't work with black people in Cuyahoga County. I hope he does a better job, because he's going to cut into Portman maybe 10, 15, 20% in the South, and if he can turn the Northeast out, he has a good chance of winning.
I'll put the reverse on to a certain degree. It goes to what Mark's just saying about the gun issue. Guns is very important to Appalachia. Ted has now shown he is anti-Second Amendment. That's not going to fly well. And you've heard me say this before. I have a better ear for urban issues than Ted Strickland does. And I'm from a county of 40,000 people and 60,000 hogs, folks.
I hope he's learned his lesson.
I don't think I've heard and seen nothing from him that indicates he has. And I think what he's going to do, he's not going to excite his base, and he's going to have Rob Portman. And Rob is a cool personality, and I think that may be part of his issue.
There's a guy named Trump who's going to excite his base.
Joe, Ted Strickland was right out there with Hillary Clinton. He was in Columbus when she was in Columbus this week.
Right.
He's not ducking from her.
He's not.
That could help him among African-American voters in Cuyahoga County if he can latch onto her coattails a little bit.
Right, that could. And I think there's another factor we're not looking at here. When you look at these polls and really dig deeper, you see who already supports Portman, who already supports Strickland. If you're looking at Portman, you're looking at men, you're looking at white people, you're looking at people who have income, you're looking at older people. You look at who supports Ted Strickland in these polls. It's women, it's people of color, it's people who don't have a lot of money, and it's also the younger people. If you have a candidate at the top of the ticket, if Hillary Clinton, and she's being bolstered now by Bernie Sanders, he's backing her, if you've got that versus Trump, who is that going to drive to the polls? And who comes out, whatever they come out for at the top, is going to have a big part of who gets elected in this race.
All right. Congresswoman Joyce Beatty of Columbus was among those who staged that sit-in on the House floor that Joe was mentioning. The Democrats demanded the House vote on 2 gun control bills, one to ban suspected terrorists from buying guns, the other to expand background checks to gun shows and internet sales. They did not get a vote, but they sent a message.
We want to make sure that Republicans understand that we are demanding them to listen to what the vast majority of all our constituents, their constituents, what Americans across the country are clamoring for.
Republicans called the move a publicity stunt and said the House action was pointless because the Senate had already voted down similar bills. Sam Gresham, this goes back to the civil rights movement, sit-ins. It was remarkable to see, but not surprising, I guess. The frustration was there.
I had heart palpitations and a tear dropped out of my eye as I watched them on television sit down. I mean, I graduated from high school in 1967, so I was in the midst of all this stuff, sit-ins. And all the sit-ins and demonstrations that I participated in college and university, it was like the young people called me the OG, the old gangster, and I keep telling them the old ways work real well. I think they were successful, and they didn't get any legislation passed, but they got the media attention. And sometimes when you do demonstration, it's not to get the chancellor to give you information, but to set the chancellor up for future actions by media covering it. They also did something in the House that has never been done. You can do a filibuster in the Senate, but it's much more difficult to do that in the House. And they found another tool, which is a demonstration to sit down and do it. Short term, they got the media. Long term, they didn't get any legislation passed, and I don't think the goal was ever to get any legislation passed.
Mark, where does this sudden Democrat courage on gun control come from? They let the assault weapons ban expire. They really didn't do a whole lot even after Sandy Hook, as far as they didn't have any sit-ins after Sandy Hook to push gun control legislation. Now they are. Why is that?
It's a good question. I think part of what you're hearing is I think there's been a tipping point here now that, have we had these shootings that it wasn't enough to sort of get the public on board, behind, tougher gun restrictions for sure. And I think the thought is, the combination maybe of the terrorist element and the mass shooting murders in Orlando maybe have gotten the public to the point where they're willing to go beyond sort of their comfort zone on this issue. But it's an open question because this is something the president in particular has led the charge for on a long time now. And, I've heard it said, and I think there's some truth to that, if we wouldn't get, some kind of action after Sandy Hook when 6-year-olds are murdered, what is it going to take? We'll see if this is a...
But Gene, we did get a small bit of action. The Senate had this bipartisan bill that was an initial vote on very modest gun control.
Yeah.
Are Republicans at a point now where they have to agree? Is the NRA at a point now where it has to agree to some modest gun control legislation?
I think what you saw, I think John Cornyn had a bill that the NRA had approved of. I think we need to keep a couple things in mind here. One, this is not so much a gun problem; this is also an FBI problem. Okay, see, Jim Comey, the head of the FBI, actually said he would prefer not notifying people who are on our watch list that they couldn't get a gun because now they've been flagged. They know that they've been flagged as being on a watch list. Here's a couple of statistics, though. Let's take the emotion out. 87% of the mass murders occur with legally purchased firearms because these are essentially, it's a murder-suicide writ large. But 90% of homicides occur with illegally purchased weapons. So you have two different types here. So you're talking about two different things. But I will tell you now, as a former legislator, when I watched what happened on the floor of the House, I was horrified. I've been in the minority, I've been in the majority. Both are difficult for different reasons. But I could see this spreading to all the state capitals, and it is horrible on both sides. No, you've never served.
But
you've never served. It would be horrible. For both sides, both minorities, parties, on either chamber, it's just horrible. This is not a democracy. That's mob rule.
Have you ever been to a House hearing and how the legislators treat the people who testify?
Oh, no.
You've never been in those hearings?
They treat them nicely because that is somebody's constituent.
No, they don't.
Oh.
The people who come testify for me, they don't. Now, let me just go to one of the things you just said. If they had to throw rocks, people in Orlando would still be alive. So don't tell me the guns didn't make a difference, whether it was an automatic gun or otherwise. If they had to throw rocks, those people would still be alive. And one of the other fallacies about guns that people don't want to talk about is this. 2/3 of the people who die from homicide commit suicide with a gun. Only 1/3 are the people going around killing people, and people don't want to talk about that.
But those are illegally purchased. So the question is, Sam, there's reality, and then there's how you'd like things to work. What we're trying to talk about there is how to get things to actually work in reality. And as a former member, I will tell you the idea of minority party engaged in sit-ins on the floor, that is not what the Founding Fathers had envisioned at all, and they would be horrified.
We'll have to move on, leave it there for now. Columbus stands ready to be a testing ground for a new transportation system. Columbus beat out San Francisco, Denver, even Austin, Texas, and 3 other cities to win the federal government's Smart Cities grant. The feds will send $40 million to Columbus. Local, public, and private sources will chip in another $90 million to develop new bus lines, launch fleets of autonomous vehicles, and develop systems that allow roads to talk to cars. Gene Krebs, you worked on smart growth and transportation issues for a while. What do you make of this? Is this a good idea?
It's a fantastic good idea, and I have to give a series of shout-outs that have not been covered. The Linden area has been the hotbed of a lot of the support for all this, and that's been driven by a couple of people, Casey Harris and Kathy McPherson, who, in full disclosure, are both trained in the Bridges methodology, and I'm co-authoring a book with the author of the Bridges Out of Poverty series, Phil Duvall, next. And so full disclosure, but it's been a highly community-based structure.
So they are community leaders?
They're community leaders, but it's about getting people who are the low income and working class to be able to get to the jobs they need to get. If you live, for example, over on Livingston, and there's a job for you in Dublin, good luck in getting there.
It's an hour and a half.
Yeah. so many bus transfers. What this is going to do is going to allow the people in the low-served communities around Columbus and around the central Ohio to be able to get to those jobs they need to get to in places like Dublin and Westerville.
Autonomous vehicles, is that realistic?
Yes, it's the future. It's
I got friends in Linden. They can't wait to get into one just to see how it works.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to be in front of one to see how it works. But Mark, I mean, this shows that Columbus is competitive. I mean, there were some pretty cool, pretty hip cities that Columbus beat out for this.
Right, and
Denver, Kansas City.
Exactly, and along the lines of what Gene is saying, one of the things that Secretary Fox, Department of Transportation, said was a big reason that Columbus won this was sort of marrying the transportation issues with, in this case, poverty, and giving access to the low-income folks to get prenatal care, whatever it's needed. And I think it's also become kind of an effective strategy from the Obama administration to put these kind of competitions out there, because absent getting some kind of funding approved through Congress, which they can't, they set up this competition, and all these cities have said they're going to still go forward with their proposals even though they didn't win.
Real quickly, Joe, it's still car-centric, though.
Yes, it's very car-centric. I was going to say that they're dealing with the spokes and not the wheel. What they need to also consider is getting massive people movers around that 270, 670 area, airport, Dublin, everywhere around there, and then use all of these things we're talking about as bridges.
We're going to get to our last topic. Columbus has lost one of its iconic leaders. Former Columbus Dispatch publisher John F. Wolfe died Friday at the age of 72. The Wolfe family just last year sold the Dispatch, but still owns Channel 10 and real estate holdings in Central Ohio. Through his business interests and his generosity, Wolfe left his name and his mark on just about everything of consequence in Central Ohio. Sam Gresham, how will you remember John F. Wolfe?
I think two things strike me right off. It reorders the pecking order of how you go see people about getting things done. The one thing I remember John F. versus Walton Wolfe was that he was an easier conversation. Walton Wolfe wasn't an easy conversation. We never got him to eventually support the levy. But
Which levy was this? The
school levies. But we did get him to do some other things. I think he was an easier conversation than any of the Wolfes I ever dealt with.
Mark, you worked with Dispatch. You worked for him. How will you remember him?
As a gentleman and somebody who really cared about his community. I mean, you could just never doubt that he wanted what was best for Columbus, and some people criticized his politics or, his approach to things, but I don't think you could ever doubt, that he wanted to see Columbus better.
Joe, it's a passing of an era. I mean, we saw the first step was last year when the Dispatch no longer was locally owned.
Right.
I mean, many other cities have gone through this, but
Right.
it was the first for Columbus, where the publisher wasn't in charge of the local paper anymore. I mean, a local publisher. What do you think this means for Columbus as far as an era passing?
Well, John F. Wolfe, anytime something big was happening in Columbus, you would look behind the scenes, and John F. Wolfe was always there. You've lost someone who would step up to the plate. And they're going to have to get some more people in Columbus because, if you look at the people who step up to the plate now, everyone's aging. They need to get some of these younger people to step up to the plate and be the kind of community players that John F. Wolfe was.
Gene, you served in the legislature. John F. Wolfe was a political force, particularly among Republicans. What type of influence did he have on you and on your fellow Republicans?
Well, he helped set the Republican agenda, but more importantly here, he helped set the Central Ohio agenda. But this is what everybody, I think, keeps talking about. But here's what you're seeing. You're seeing the maturation of Columbus, where like any other town, the homegrown, family-run titans, multi-generational titans are passing, and now it's all about corporate. The challenge for Columbus and Central Ohio is now to develop very strong institutions that can begin to replace the family titan structure. If you can do that in Columbus/Central Ohio, you move forward. If not, you end up like Gallion.
Can we do that, Sam?
I think we have to. One of my comments was the pecking orders now reordered. You don't know where to go if you're a community person to get things done. I think Gene's point, too, is a maturation, but it's also a transition. Mm-hmm. My problem with institutional leaders, they come and go. Mm-hmm. There's a corporate person in charge of this. You don't have that community commitment.
I agree, but this is the world we live in.
Yep. All right, it's time now for our final off-the-record parting shots, and we will start with you, Gene.
Some insiders will tell you that the Ron O'Brien re-election effort for county prosecutor is the second most important race in the state. Other ones will tell you actually it is the most important race in the state and easily beats Rob Portman, primarily for the influence his office has on State House and statewide office holders, and expect that towards the end. You've not covered anything on it now, but by the end, that will be a huge race.
Because as Franklin County prosecutor, he's in charge of enforcing the law at the State House.
Yes.
Sam.
I'm going to gloat for a few moments. I told y'all that the Cavaliers were going to win the NBA championship. And for all you doubters, now we're going to work on getting the Indians to win the World Series next.
We'll see. Mark.
Speaking of the Cavs, one of the benefits of winning the title, besides bringing a championship to Cleveland for the first time in 52 years, was that it meant a big parade in downtown Cleveland with like 1.3 million persons. And if nothing else, hopefully that gives Cleveland and Cuyahoga County some practice with dealing with large crowds ahead of the Republican convention next month, because there's still lingering questions about if Cleveland ready.
And there were no problems, really. There was some guys eating weird things, but other than that, there was no problems. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, we've got these outlet malls open in Delaware County now, and an already congested area has now become worse, as we've seen. It's starting to affect business because no one can get anywhere anymore. But I'm going to predict that nothing's going to be done in the short term, and the Browns may even win a Super Bowl before we get this problem fixed.
Wow, that's a long time from now. England is thousands and thousands of miles away, but the similarities between what went on there and what's going on here in our presidential race they're palpable. And even the hairstyles of Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, who could be the next prime minister, and the hairstyle of Donald Trump have some similarities. So if that happens here, it's going to be really interesting in the next 3 or 4 months. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online, Facebook, Twitter, our website, WOSU.org. For our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.